This is GARIS Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 355, entitled "The Masculist FIPping of Women is one of history's greatest milestones." Description. This flyer explains why the masculist FIPping of women will prove to be one of the greatest milestones in history, as masculist moral pressure on women causes millions of them, and later billions of them, to adopt FIP lifestyles, profoundly changing society, comparable to the male invention of the contraceptive pill that allowed women to take up careers. The flyer itself, open. Make it a bit bigger. The masculist FIPping of women is one of history's major milestones, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. I have moments when the importance of what the masculists are doing to society really hits home. I believe that the masculist FIPping of women is one of those major historical moments, a historical watershed, to rank with women getting the vote, the invention of the contraceptive pill, etc. That is, having a profound political and social impact, affecting the lives of literally billions of people, as the planet's population gets caught up in these deep historical changes. Let me try to spell this out, since the idea of the masculist FIPping of women is almost totally unknown in today's, that's 2020, world. Firstly, some definitions. What does the expression of the FIPping of women mean? It means forcing, that is, the masculist forcing of women to FIP up. What does to FIP up mean? It means to become a FIP, that is, a financially independent person. That is, someone who bothers to get a career-competent education so that they're capable of earning a good salary, so that they do not expect to parasite off the money and labour of another person. As is typical, even the definition of a fluffy, that is, a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money of a man, off some gullible, ignorant man-slave who has been brainwashed his whole young life that his role in life is to be a man-slave to a fluffy parasite, to sacrifice his life working for a woman. One of the greatest of social revolutions to ever have occurred in history was the male invention of the contraceptive pill. It changed everything. Up until the 1960s, when the pill was invented, women did not have truly reliable contraception, so sexual intercourse was always associated with the risk, and hence the terrible costs, of an unwanted pregnancy. With the pill, women were freed from this risk, which changed them profoundly. Women were able to behave sexually like men, that is, they could be sexual without risk, in brackets, assuming they did not expose themselves to STDs, that's sexually transmitted diseases. And even if they did get infected, the invention of penicillin usually solved that problem, in brackets. Once women could reliably control the number of children they had, they chose to have far fewer of them, and as a result have much higher living standards, satisfying their desire to be mothers, a very powerful instinct that millions of years have bred into them, while spending the money they would have spent on a dozen kids, as was the case with their grandmothers, on themselves, on vacations, nicer homes, better, more expensive education, etc. The birth rate plummeted, health standards rose, children survived, so women were content to have typically in today's first world 0, 1 or 2 kids. It's rare nowadays to see a woman have more than 2 kids, given that it's so expensive to raise a child. For example, in the US, $200,000, given today's expectations of living standards. But with maximum 2 children, and with men having given women modern medicine, with life expectancies well into the 80s, women began to notice in huge numbers that they had time on their hands once their second child was off to kindergarten or to school. In the early 60s, a collective upper middle class malaise or ennui made itself felt, as upper middle class women felt something missing in their lives. The US journalist Betty Friedan, in brackets, whom I chatted with for about 10 minutes in Copenhagen at the United Nations Mid-Decade for Women conference, about women's and men's liberation. Friedan was smart enough to see that women's lib would also liberate men from being the man-slaves they had been since the Industrial Revolution. Then wrote her famous book, The Feminine Mystique, which asked the question of upper middle class white women, is this all? She advocated that women take up careers and be like men, having the ambitions of men, and finding themselves, challenging themselves in the workplace. In the early 70s, I became obsessed with second-wave feminism, as this baby boomer generation of women's lib was called. I grew up in the 50s and 60s when women were housewives, like my mother, whom I found, that is, both my mother and her generation of women, paralytically boring. I was hoping at the time that feminism would make women interesting, that is, worth talking with, being capable of sharing my male brain with its intellectual passions for the sciences and math. That never happened, by the way. But in the 70s, I was not yet aware of women's genetically determined inferiorities, so my hope at the time proved, with hindsight, to be premature and naive. Despite all that, the invention of the pill, the great enabler of the second wave of feminism, created profound historical changes in women's role. Instead of being a housewife staying at home raising a dozen kids, women had usually maximum 2 kids and took up a career, at least to some extent. The stage is now set for another major historical shift to occur in the near future, and that is the FIPping of women by the Masculists. To understand this, consider the following timeline depicting the typical lifespan and occupation of a woman who gets a career-competent education, has 2 kids, and is a FIP for most of her adult life. We assume she's upper middle class, the class in which most social revolutions start, then spread down to the middle class and later to the working class, and is smart enough to go to university to get a good career-competent education with the intention of becoming a FIP, a financially responsible adult, expecting to pay her own way through life, and not expecting, as is the case in today's world, where 3/4 of young women expect at the back of their minds that some Prince Charming, that is, some gullible manslave, will pay for her to stay at home in a middle-class house she can raise her children full-time and have him pay for it all. This is the dream of most young women today, but the Masculists are changing all that. Returning to the timeline. She studies math and a science at high school as her major, with English Lit and History as her minors. At university, she studies one of the STEM fields or a profession, for example, medicine, dentistry, architecture, law, etc., and ends up with a diploma and a skill that the economy values and will pay well for. She graduates at age 23. Instead of riding what the MGTOWs, that's men going their own way, that is an important branch of the men's lib movement, call the cock carousel, that is having some 40 different penises in her by the time she's 30, as is the average, as modern statistics show, she marries a few years later, meeting her husband at work, who makes good money as well. She works in her profession until she is 27, then gets pregnant with her first child. She then stays home raising her 2 children, in brackets, assuming that when all this is happening, that men's lib, masculism, has been around for long enough for the men-fairing of the gender laws to have occurred, so that divorce does not financially massacre a married father, so that her husband is prepared to be a father, much more risk-free, a situation which is much less likely in today's age, where one married father in 4 gets financially crucified in the fluffy feminist hypocrite-dominated divorce court system, where he will lose his kids with 90% probability, lose his house to her, half his stuff, forced to pay payments to children he will barely see, and if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may have to pay her alimony for life, with no moral or legal obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up. She is 30 by the time her second child is born, and 36 by the time her second child is off to school at the age of 6. She then returns to her profession, so that the financial burden of paying for the costs of the family do not fall entirely on her husband. If there were a divorce during these early child years, then assuming the men-fairing of the gender laws has already occurred, then the father would automatically expect to get joint custody. He would keep his house, or the proportion of its ownership, when it was purchased. He would pay no alimony because his wife is a FIP, a professional. With joint custody, he would expect to pay for half of the costs of his kids, because they are his kids, not hers. In this, 50-50. Unlike the legal norm today, where the mother gets sole custody of the kids in about 90% of cases in many Western countries. It's not surprising that in today's Western countries, 2/3 of young men give the finger to marriage and paternity, since they refuse to run a risk of 1 in 4 of being financially crucified in a hated, fluffy feminist dominated divorce court system, so wipe their hands of marriage and paternity. With the above couple, if they divorce, she gets back to work because she can, because she bothered to FIP up, which is what masculists in today's world are pushing women to do. The above timeline for women is what the masculists are strongly recommending. Given that the birth rate in most Western countries is now well below replacement rate, which is, in brackets, of 2.1 children per woman, if this trend continues, then we wipe ourselves out, as any simple math calculation shows. The above marriage model solves the population annihilation problem, since the couple have replaced themselves with their 2 kids. Governments can allow couples to have fewer kids for a generation or so to solve the global warming problem, because there are too many people on the planet. But at some point, governments need to push masculist legislation to encourage men to be fathers again. Otherwise, we do wipe ourselves out. So we have here the conditions of a major historic change in society, as men get the men-fairing of the gender laws that they need, that they are screaming out for. In brackets, for example, the legislation of the paternity rejection right, that would allow a man to reject an unwanted pregnancy, in just the same way as women have the maternity rejection right, commonly known as the abortion right. The fact that in today's world women have the legal right to reject an unwanted pregnancy but men don't is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists, and it's not against women but against men. Today's fluffy feminist biased gender laws see men merely as cash machines, to be abused and robbed, not treated as human beings. This fluffy feminazi attitude cannot continue. Fathers cannot continue to be financially crucified in the hated fluffy feminist dominated divorce courts, because if things don't change, men will snap, take up arms and launch a sex war, assassinating the gender politicians, murdering thousands of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges, and even going out into the streets and simply shooting the feminazi vermin who have made men's lives so miserable, who see men as cattle to serve fluffy parasites. End of part 1.